Now, I'm not gonna lie, I've never really been fond of Highlander. He's always been this character I could never wrap my head around. I've always avoided playing him for these reasons of not knowing how to balance his nature of his stances, offensive and defensive. Safe to say, plenty of players felt that way since his launch. Sure, in today's game you could kind of play him without the cool little things in his kit, but you're gonna feel like you're playing with mud in your shoes if you don't. And I can vouch for this feeling because when I picked him up again, I felt like I was trying to drive a semi-truck while under the influence. Without utilizing his entire kit to the fullest, he just didn't feel right. But as I got to understand the hero, he still felt like a semi-truck, but at least I wasn't drunk driving. People are probably confused on the title of the video. What could he possibly mean by buggiest hero? Well, the answer is quite simple. In my hands, I have 6 pages worth of Highlander text that were completely unintended by the devs, but players found them and made Highlander very unique. And we'll talk about some of them, but in this video, I'm not going to talk about all of them. So if you want to see them, I'm going to link them in the description. Highlander was For Honor's third ever DLC hero released beside Gladiator during the Year of the Grudge and Glory on August 15th, 2017. He would be the first ever DLC hero for the Vikings faction. So, how was Highlander on his launch? Now, it's really safe to say that in For Honor's early stages of the game, there was two ways a hero would be released. Either blatantly broken like Centurion was on launch, or piss poor and clunky like Highlander was. Highlander was safe to say a struggle bus with plenty of problems coming from his kit itself being lackluster and honestly unfinished. For example, his Celtic Curse was unable to be soft painted into offensive stance and could not track people running away from him, and also could not be target swapped. That means if you were going to Celtic Curse someone, you were basically saying, I think you're a fucking moron and I think I can hit you with this move. Highlander also suffered heavily from stamina problems. When I said he handled like a semi-truck, I wasn't lying. He was slow and cumbersome and easily exhausted. The biggest problems came from the fact that if you wanted to go into your offensive stance, you had to actually use stamina to do so. Not only use stamina, but regeneration was paused while dodging an offensive form. Why? I don't know, just fuck you, that's why. So if his offensive form wasn't very good, and had its problems, how was his defensive form? Honestly, it wasn't much better, to be honest. In today's game, Highlander's offensive form far overshadows his defensive form as well, and back then it was the same thing, where Highlander's chain lights were not only slow and clunky, but had no hyper armor. It's safe to say that everyone and their mothers knew that Highlander just was not a very good hero, and in Ubisoft fashion, they took their sweet time actually doing anything about it. So after 6 long months of waiting, Ubisoft would roll out hero reworks to characters that were struggling. Kensei got his rework, which I've covered in the last video. Conqueror would see changes as well. Berserker, Highlander, and Nobushi would all go through some new reworks. So what did they do for Highlander? Honestly, compared to the other heroes, not very much, but I guess better than nothing. Celtic Curse was now able to be soft painted into offensive stance if you had the heavy attack button. It increased the tracking on a top heavy, and allowed Celtic Curse to be target swapped to other targets in team fights. For a hero that was able to hard-hitting hero, Ubisoft didn't think he was hitting hard enough, so they buffed all of his heavy damage numbers. Combined with that, Highlander would also now get hyper armor on follow-up light attacks. They increased tracking on caber toss to catch dodges better and increased the forward momentum in his offensive stance forward dodges. They also fixed all the issues with his offensive stance, for example, removing the stamina pause on offensive stance and allowing him to regen stamina on dodging again. Why did they ever ship it out like this? Beats me, but you know, Ubisoft, their favorite drink is stupid juice. So what begs the question again is, how was Highlander? Well, it's almost like nothing changed. Sure, he was a little less clunky, but there were so many attributes where Highlander just struggled. The biggest thing that turned a lot of For Honor players away from playing Highlander was the fact that on guard break, a heavy attack was not confirmed. Not only that, but on a light parry, a defensive heavy attack was also not confirmed. So it begs the question, what does Highlander get on guard break? Well, he either got a light attack or a zone, and the zone attack also had its issues. Highlander's old zone is kind of like what we have today in terms of animation, but had no feintable properties. Him, Centurion, and Shinobi all struggled earlier in the days from the unusable zone problem because, sure, the first hit would connect, but if your opponent didn't die from that first hit, the other 3 attacks were not feintable, so you were literally just a free parry. So unless your opponent would die from the zone, you would choose the light attack instead, normally falling up into your offensive stance. So if a Highlander got a light parry, what was the punish? Well, Highlander players found out that with the light parry animation, they could animation cancel into their offensive stance by holding down the heavy button during the light parry, and the heavy attack from offensive stance would land just in time. But if you were used to any other hero, you'd be used to getting any heavy off of a light parry. So if you were late on holding down the button, you would just not get the heavy attack. So not only do you have to light parry, you have to jump through different hurdles trying to get the correct punish off, when every other hero in the game can just punish it normally. So if you want to know how old Highlander used to be, the best word I can use is technical. You had to do so much more and be so much more mindful of everything you were doing. or you would basically just die. This led to the hyper defensive playstyle all Highlanders would eventually adapt. Crushing counters in today's game can be an amazing tool in teamfights and duels alike. You have a great defensive option, but what if I told you that they used to be better? Not too long ago, all heroes with crushing counters got a pseudo nerf to their backwards movement on light attacks. Highlander was the biggest culprit of abusing this movement tool in his crushing counters and the hitboxes tied to them. Fighting a Highlander back then was basically a chore, only because 90% of the time a Highlander player would spend the fight backing up constantly with one plan in mind. They would hope that you'd want to close the distance on them with a gap closer that was easily crushing counterable. This was the safest way to play Highlander back then, because if they tried to attack into your light attack hitbox would interrupt them from reaching you, also putting yourself into offensive stance with a tech called Phantom Rage. Now Phantom Rage was a combination of just terrible hitboxes and the crushing counter hitbox, allowing Highlander to basically backstep light, making him unparryable, and also giving him a hitbox in front of him, meaning that if you tried to walk into him, you got hit by the hitbox, and if you tried to parry the light, you just didn't have the reach for it. So if they didn't choose the closer distance, then they got into the offensive stance for free, where yet again, they would fish for another bad option or gap closer with this first tech that we are going to talk about. Wave dashing is Highlander's most known tech on the planet and was the easiest one to pull off. If you're not aware of Highlander's wave dashing, here's a quick example. In today's game, if you want to dodge an offensive stance, you have to wait for the recovery frames to end to dodge again. But with wave dashing, you would switch guards while dodging to decrease the recovery frames after dodging, allowing you to dodge more frequently. Okay, so if you want that in English, Highlander had dodge cancels with wave dashing. Every Highlander would utilize this because, honestly, you had to. Without wave dashing, offensive stance would be awful because obviously it has no guard, it has no dodge attack. So you'd be sitting there with no guard waiting for any attack to instantly beat you out. So again, what Highlander players would do is fish for gap closers with their backstep lights, and if they went into offensive stance and saw a gap closer coming, they would instantly start wave dashing out of the way and then get a free punish on you. And this was not fun. Look, man, I'm not gonna lie. Fighting a quote-unquote good Highlander player was just not fun because of one simple rule that one of my friends said one day. If you're playing for fun, the Highlander player will always win. But if you're playing to win, the Highlander player will always lose. This sense is tied towards Highlander's wave dashing and the most infamous combo in the game, kick to caber toss. Highlander's offensive stance kick was basically a double-edged sword. It had no feintable properties and next to no tracking at all. The cool thing is that you could soft feint all of your heavy attacks into kicks. This would help because Highlander's offensive heavies were basically unfeintable. But the problem is that the kick only landed if the opponent ever went for the parry. If the opponent wanted to dodge the incoming attack, the kick would just not track. But on the other side of the sword was the 40 damage this bash came with before CCU damage was taken. So obviously everyone was extremely scared of getting hit by this kick because that was a quarter of your health gone in one bash. So what all Highlander players did was go from kick to caber toss, which also did 40 damage. Again, a quarter of your health. So to counter kick the grab, you either had to play a hero capable of double dodging, which was only really Warden for the time, or have a wide or fast dodge attack. And keep in mind, a lot of characters did not have dodge attacks back then. Warlord, Scent, and even Highlander themselves did not have quick and easy access to these dodge attacks that allowed them to counter kick the grab. The other counter was straight up just calling the Highlander's bluff and staring him down waiting for the kick to caber toss animation to start. This was basically the hardest one because you had to make a massive read that if you got wrong, you're taking 40 damage. The third way and the easiest counter that anyone could do was just rolling away from Highlander. Since he had no or whatsoever, kick the caber toss would not track rolls whatsoever. So if you wanted to beat a Highlander, all you needed to do was really roll away. There was a fourth option, but this only worked for two heroes, and that was Shigoki and Aramusha. Both of these heroes had a old unique feat in the game called Rocksteady. Rocksteady was a tier 2 passive feat that would make it impossible for heroes to be knocked down to the ground, even when out of stamina. So when a Highlander player grabbed one of these heroes and threw them to the ground, they would get up like nothing happened. So this is exactly what I meant by if you're playing for fun, the Highlander will always win, because people that played for fun never dodge rolled away from a fight and just tried to make the right read. But if the person is playing to win, the moment they see any of these animations start, they will just roll away, making the Highlander lose in the long run because he doesn't have a usable kit. So to put yourself in the Highlander's shoes, you were already playing the hardest hero in the game, but the one and only saving grace you had was being consistently rolled away from. Or you were on the other side that felt like you're losing to pure quote-unquote bug abuse in the prolonged fights with the worst hero in the game, so you couldn't have a valid complaint about Highlander other than just saying it's bullshit. When you saw a Highlander in the game, it always fell into two categories. The first one was people who actually didn't know what they were doing and just went for crushing counter attempts only to get light parried and die all the time. And the people who spent all of their free time learning every single tech, bringing Highlander from the worst hero in the game to almost the worst hero in the game, while terrorizing any casual lobby you set foot in and getting your ass blasted in any high level lobby because people who understood playing the game like it's Dark Souls meant you could never actually hit them. Highlander would see no notable changes for another 4 years. The only thing I can think of notably is his buff to up his offensive lights. These were the fastest lights in the game by a mile, being 400 ms with 100 ms hidden indicator. But the downside of them is that you can only throw about 4 or 5 of them without putting yourself out of stamina. You have to remember, being out of stamina back then was a lot harsher because of stamina pause and the way that you didn't regain stamina when you got up. So using this move was basically setting yourself up for failure. The devs realized that he was struggling to find an actual good opener, so they reduced the stamina cost allowing Highlander to 5 max to around 10 max before running out of stamina. This change would be fine for the time because Highlander needed a reliable opener move to apply pressure, but we will talk about more of his offensive lights later. So after a long 4 years of Highlander players begging for any love from the devs, For Honor would finally grace their eyes on September 14th, 2023 with Highlander's first ever hero rework. This would address everything, and when I mean everything, I mean everything. So get your popcorn out, boys, because there's going to be a lot of reading. And don't worry, girls, I see you too. Let's start off with Highlander's new quality of life change. Highlander would have all instances of his stamina damage and stamina pause removed from his kit. Weird, you might be saying you didn't talk about stamina damage at all. Highlander had a special tech that was just special to him alone, that people called the triangle tech. Why it's named like that, I have some sort of idea we'll get to later. Basically, if a Highlander would kick you into a wall, he could wave dash by switching his guard and kick you into the wall again and again and again. So this basically made it so you would be constantly losing stamina because of the kick's stamina pause and stamina drain until you were completely out of stamina. I'm guessing they named it the triangle tech because you would have to swap your guard constantly, making it into some sort of triangle pattern. The devs fully realized that an infinite wall spot tech that would drain all of your opponent's stamina, making fights super unfun when a Highlander's near a wall, was not very fun. So to combat that, they outright removed all stamina damage on their kicks. They also removed the ability to hold down guard break after a missed kick to initiate another kick right after. I don't know if this was a tech because, it was intended by the devs as a mechanic, but what they didn't expect was that Highlander was able to kick again after missing a kick before he could be guard broken. They made it so that his offensive stance was a bit easier to access. They made it that on heavy feint you can also hold the heavy attack button to feint in the animation to offensive form. They would also address his phantom range by lowering his movement on backwards lights by half a meter and lowering the damage from his crushing counters from 20 down to 18. They also stripped his hyper armor on chain lights. They sped up his heavies from 1000 ms or 1 whole second to 800, and they dropped the damage from 30 to 24. This change was actually huge if you think about it because that meant these heavy attacks were fast enough to be confirmed on guard breaks. They also sped up his side heavy openers by 100 ms and toned the damage down from 30 down to 27 and gave it medium hit stun instead of heavy hit stun. They made his zone attack actually usable. First things first, they allowed it to be feinted in all versions of the zone. Third hit, second hit, and even before the first hit even comes out, they could all be feinted. They also swapped the hyper armor to 500 ms after startup and allowed the third hit of the zone to chain into all heavy attacks. Talking about heavy attacks, they also allowed it to chain into zone attack, causing some really funny interactions that can make Highlander really frustrating. Basically, if a Highlander whiffs his heavy, finisher, or Celtic Curse, he can follow up with a zone attack that has 0 guard break vulnerability. So if someone goes for a guard break after dodging your finisher heavy, you can briskly slap them in the face for even trying it. Moving on to his offensive stance, his kick could now be feinted. They decided to keep Caber Toss soft feint in there just because they did not feel the need to remove it. And speaking of Caber Toss, they added a new way to use it. Before, the only way to use Caber Toss was holding backwards and guard breaks. This made it really easy to dodge on its own and had really hard times tracking rolls. So they decided to give Highlander a new use for it on forward and side dodges, increasing the forward movement by 2 units and became faster when used as a dodge attack, and increased its recovery on pin duration frames. So this testing rounds for Highlander was, yeah, I remember these days of the testing grounds, and these days were not good memories. While 90% of the changes were good, it only took one wrong thing to make Highlander a nightmare and completely unfun to play against, and that was his dodge attack, Caber Toss. So on dodge attack, Highlander got a free knockdown. A dodge attack. Let that just sink in for a second. A dodge attack that confirms 26 damage from Highlander and has massive synergies with other Highlanders, Centurions, and Jormungandrs. This testing grounds lasted for about 1 whole week, so not very long time before Highlander players had to go back to the dogshit version of themselves, and go back they did, for almost an entire year. Highlander's rework would be held by Ubisoft in complete secrecy. Not a single word would ever be spoken to the community about this rework, leaving players in a lot of confusion. Which is really funny because I remember in one of the Warriors that they said they received a ton of feedback from players, but again did not specify on any of this feedback. For Honor devs have a great history where they would keep reworks under NDA for over a year, with the greatest example of Centurion's rework being over a year and a half of nothing. So almost an entire year has gone by and Highlander's rework was never talked about again. until April 24th, 2024, where Highlanders Rework would finally go live. And for the things Highlanders lost, he lost his side dodge caber toss, which was no big deal because everyone was in agreement that this was an awful change to begin with. But the change that nobody saw coming was when Ubisoft removed the wave dash from Highlander. This sent outrage through entire Highlander factions. If you asked a Highlander what change they would want reversed, it would be the removal of wave dash. Ubisoft tried to justify this by adding that dodge attack to his offensive form, but every single player agreed that this was worse in every single scenario. Now the true question comes, was the removal of wave dash justified? And that answer can vary on player to player. In my personal experience, I didn't mind wave dashes. I think it brought a super cool risk reward factor, but was also very flashy and flary to the side of Highlander. But it did have its problems from a technical level, like allowing Highlanders to trump all level 3 bashes with wave dashing and also other exploits that were mentioned, like the triangle tech that was only accessible because of wave dashing. So my answer would be this: if they could fix the other exploits caused by wave dashing, then I guess it should have stayed. But if it was impossible to fix without removing wave dashes, then I guess they did what they had to do. After all these changes, something did bother a lot of Highlander players. A lot of these players only mained him because he was very technical and extremely hard to pull off. So one day they woke up and their hero lost all its technical ability with the removal of wave dashes, and it became super easy that anyone could really play him. It took a while, but after a lot of the complaining, Highlander mains did find out some of their older techs still worked, that still had skill ceilings paired to it. For example, his old parry tech. Basically, if you held down the heavy attack button in the middle of the parry animation, you would go into offensive stance easily. This did one less damage than his normal parries, but also put more hit stun on the opponent. On top of that, a tech that I could never replicate myself was the emote cancel tech. This tech is exactly how it sounds. You use Highlander's offensive stance taunt while letting go of the heavy attack, masking the animation of leaving offensive stance, making someone panic, and if you're good enough, you can parry the incoming attack. This tech, in my opinion, is extremely cool and full on style. There is no complaining about it because it's so hard to pull off, and provided takes no advantage in gameplay because just leaving offensive form and parrying is just easier already. But this doesn't mean that all of his techs take skill. For example, the emote light tech. Again, as it's on paper, you emote an offensive stance and then use an offensive light attack. The advantage of this gives a decreasing amount of guard swap frames, making lights way more difficult to react to. The problem is that these lights were already near impossible to react to without this tech, so adding the emote can just be frustrating more than useful. This is where we get back to the offensive light topic, as why I think it's the biggest problem with Highlander. Back when Highlander was this doo-doo dogshit hero, I was fine with the fact that he had to use these lights because it was the only good option he could viably rely on. But now that he has better options, I think they should revert the change or nerf it closer to how they used to be. You can almost win an entire fight with these offensive lights alone because the stamina cost is small and the damage is pretty high for the speed of these attacks. So if a Highlander gets lazy, they can just win by abusing this over and over and over again. It's not a fun mechanic and will never be in this state. Applying the emote light tech, it's just not fun. Since we're on the topic of frustrating mechanics, we need to talk about confirm ganks, and Highlander has one of the easiest. The easiest one in the game is Highlander's infinite caber toss. This needs 2 Highlanders, but basically how it works is after a Highlander caber tosses and throws the opponent to the ground and does a heavy, the other Highlander behind him will caber toss as well, making it an infinite. I truly apologize for the poor bastards who had to deal with me doing this, but your sacrifice for content is something I appreciate. So at the end of the day, what makes Highlander fun and entices people to play him? The first thing that comes to mind is his fashion. Highlander's fashion is mostly agreed as the best Viking fashion in the entire faction. All Highlanders look unique with their copious amount of good armor other than his helmets. These things suck. And yes, I'm calling the bowl cut bad. And I know Havoc is gonna hate me for that one. His executions can be really hit or miss for some players. While some suck massive monkey balls, the others are brutal pieces of combat which make me really question the sanity of the people who come up with them. His voice acting is immaculate. Again, something very commonly said about 90% of the roster, but there is a reason why people love his voice. It's rough, but also smooth. Words cannot describe this voice, but I bet the voice actor behind Highlander is just a handsome man. The thing that really makes Highlander stand out in his uniqueness is obviously the amount of text you can pull off with him. I know I've talked a lot about how much I hate text in this game like Challenge Flicker and Zerk tech, but this is because these give blatant advantages. You know what doesn't give me an advantage? Throwing it back like I'm Shakira. The twerk tech is probably the funniest tech in the game because it provides no advantage when I'm using it other than confusing the fuck out of an opponent, making him stare at my ass. But that's the thing. You can do this on Highlander that you can't do on any other character. He just has all this bugginess to him that makes him so lovable and people want to figure out more things with him every single day. Highlander is probably the most unique hero that comes with all the cool things you can do with him. And I had the privilege to play with Slanders, a man who dedicates himself to Highlander and has plenty of funny little texts he performs with things like Bear Trap. And remember, as always, I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. And if you've made it this far, this project took me a really long time, and if you still haven't subbed, I mean, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that button. But, nevertheless, I hope you have a great day.
Fuck, dude, were you recording?
I got it for you.